"Don't touch her. You'll just make it worse," someone snapped from the crowd. But the man they were warning didn't even look up. Rain fell in thin, relentless lines across the dark stretch of highway, turning the asphalt into a mirror of blurred headlights and uncertainty. And in the middle of it all, a crumpled luxury sedan sat at an angle that didn't belong to anything stable or safe. A few cars had slowed, a few people had stepped out, but most kept their distance, watching, whispering, waiting for someone else to take responsibility. Ethan Cole didn't wait. "She's still breathing," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, as he crouched beside the driver's side, his jeans already soaked through from kneeling on the wet pavement. "You even know what you're doing," a man behind him called out, half skeptical, half amused. Ethan didn't answer. He reached carefully, steady hands moving with a kind of calm that didn't match the chaos around him, and gently eased the woman away from the deployed airbag, making sure her head was supported, his movements deliberate, respectful, controlled. The rain softened against his shoulders as if the night itself was holding its breath. For a moment, everything slowed. The hum of distant engines, the murmur of strangers, the flashing hazard lights reflecting off chrome and glass, and all that remained was the quiet rhythm of someone choosing to help when no one else would. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked softly, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone that didn't demand attention but earned it. Her eyelids fluttered slightly, just enough to tell him she was still there, still fighting in her own silent way. Ethan exhaled, a small, almost invisible release of tension, and slipped off his worn jacket, draping it carefully over her shoulders to shield her from the cold rain that kept falling without apology. Behind him, a siren began to rise in the distance, faint at first, then growing, but Ethan didn't look back. He stayed exactly where he was, one hand steady, the other resting lightly near hers, not holding, not forcing, just present. "You should step back," another voice said, sharper now, edged with authority. "Emergency services are on the way." Ethan nodded once, but didn't move immediately. "Just making sure she's okay," he replied, his tone calm, almost unshakable. The man scoffed under his breath. "People like you always think you're the hero." That word hung in the air for a second, heavy and misplaced, but Ethan didn't react. He had heard worse. He had lived through worse. Slowly, as the distant sirens grew louder and blue lights began to flicker at the edge of the road, he adjusted the jacket one last time, ensuring it covered her completely, then rose to his feet without urgency, without pride, without any need to be seen. The crowd barely noticed when he stepped back, blending into the edges of the scene like he had never been there at all. But what no one knew, what no one even thought to ask, was that in those quiet, unnoticed minutes, a struggling single dad had just changed the course of something far bigger than a single night on a rainy highway. And before the storm was over, the truth behind that moment would leave an entire room in silence. The sirens arrived too late to witness the choice that had already been made, and by the time the ambulance lights painted the road in red and blue, Ethan Cole was already stepping away, his boots quiet against the rain-soaked pavement, as if he understood something the others did not, that the most important moments rarely needed an audience. "Sir, did you see what happened?" A paramedic called out, scanning the small gathering with practiced urgency. Ethan paused for half a second, just long enough to turn his head slightly. "Just got here," he said, his voice even, unremarkable, the kind of answer that did not invite more questions. The paramedic nodded and moved on, already focused on the woman, already assuming the story had begun without him. Behind the flashing lights, someone muttered, "Figures," and another voice added, "Guy probably just wanted to look involved." Ethan did not respond. He pulled his sleeves down over his hands, rain dripping from the fabric, and walked back toward his old pickup truck parked a few yards away, its faded paint barely reflecting the chaos behind him. Inside, the cab smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee, a quiet contrast to the tension outside. He sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening as the world behind him grew louder, busier, more official, and then he started the engine without looking back. The windshield wipers dragged slowly across the glass, pushing away the rain in uneven arcs, and for a brief second, his reflection appeared in the dim interior light, tired eyes, steady expression, nothing remarkable to anyone who did not know where to look. "Daddy," A small voice echoed in his memory, soft and familiar, and it was enough to pull him forward. By the time he reached the edge of town, the storm had begun to ease, leaving behind slick roads and a silence that felt heavier than the rain itself. At home, the porch light was still on, a warm glow against the dark, and as he stepped inside, he was greeted by the quiet rhythm of a life built on small, consistent sacrifices. "You are late," his daughter said from the couch, her voice gentle but observant, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a book resting open in her lap. "Road was bad," Ethan replied, setting his keys down in the same spot he always did, his tone calm, controlled. She studied him for a moment, eyes sharp in the way only children could be. "You helped someone, didn't you?" He hesitated, just slightly. "Someone needed it." She nodded as if that answer was enough, as if she already understood something deeper than the words themselves. "You always do," she said softly. Ethan gave a small smile, the kind that never asked to be noticed, and walked into the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, the world continued, news spreading, reports forming, narratives beginning to take shape without him in them. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet hospital room filled with machines that hummed instead of spoke, the woman he had pulled from the wreck lay still beneath white sheets, her identity hidden behind silence and unanswered questions. And as the night settled into something calmer, something almost peaceful, a single detail remained unnoticed by everyone except the one person who needed it most, the worn jacket still resting over her shoulders, carrying with it the quiet trace of a man who had already disappeared before anyone thought to ask his name. Morning arrived without ceremony, just a pale wash of light slipping through thin curtains and settling quietly across the small living room where everything had its place and nothing was wasted. And Ethan Cole was already awake before the sun had fully risen, standing at the kitchen counter with a mug in his hands that had long gone lukewarm, his thoughts not loud but steady, like a tide that never quite stopped moving. "You are thinking about it," his daughter said from behind him, her voice soft but certain, and he turned slightly, offering a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Just another day," he replied, though they both knew that was not entirely true. She watched him for a moment, then nodded, accepting the answer the way children sometimes accept things they do not fully understand, and returned to her breakfast, the quiet clink of her spoon against the bowl filling the space between them. Across town, in a private hospital wing where silence was measured and controlled, the woman lay still beneath clean white sheets, her breathing steady now, her face calm in a way that suggested distance rather than peace, and beside her bed, a nurse adjusted a monitor before pausing, her eyes catching on something that did not belong to the room. "That is not ours," she murmured, gently lifting the worn jacket draped carefully over the patient's shoulders, its fabric rough, its weight unfamiliar in a place defined by polished surfaces and quiet precision. Another nurse glanced over. "Probably from the scene," she said, but her tone held curiosity. She should not have it in here. Still, neither of them moved to take it away immediately, as if something about it felt intentional, as if removing it too quickly would disturb something unseen. Hours later, a doctor stepped in, flipping through a chart with measured focus before looking up. "Any identification yet?" he asked. "Not confirmed," the nurse replied. "But there is something else." When she came in, she was holding onto that jacket like it mattered. The doctor glanced at it briefly, then back at the patient. "People hold on to strange things when they are scared," he said, though even he did not sound entirely convinced. Back in his world, Ethan had already moved on to work, his hands busy with routine, fixing what could be fixed, adjusting what could be adjusted, never rushing, never drawing attention, and to anyone watching, he was just another man doing what he needed to do to get through the day. "You see the news this morning?" a coworker asked, wiping his hands on a rag, the television in the corner murmuring low. Ethan shook his head. "Did not have time." The man nodded toward the screen. "Big accident last night. Some high-profile woman. They are saying it might turn into something bigger." Ethan glanced up briefly, just long enough to see a blurred image of flashing lights and a damaged vehicle. Nothing clear, nothing personal, just another story in a world full of them. "Hope she is okay," he said simply, before returning to his work. The coworker shrugged. People like that always are. The words hung in the air, casual, dismissive, But Ethan did not challenge them. He just kept working, steady and quiet, the same way he always had, unaware that somewhere not far away, a woman was beginning to stir from a silence that would soon carry his unseen act into a world far louder than the one he had chosen to live in. And when that moment came, it would not ask for permission, it would not announce itself with noise, it would simply arrive, and everything that had been overlooked would finally be seen. By late afternoon, the city had already begun to rewrite the story, not with facts, but with fragments, short clips stitched together without context. And somewhere between speculation and certainty, a version of the truth took shape that did not include the man who had been there first. Authorities are still investigating the cause, a news anchor said calmly from the small television mounted in the corner of the auto shop, her voice polished, distant, controlled. Sources suggest a possible third party may have been involved before emergency services arrived. One of the mechanics glanced up, frowning slightly. Third party, he repeated. What does that even mean? Another shrugged. Means someone messed with something they should not have. Ethan did not look up this time. He kept his focus on the engine in front of him, tightening a bolt with steady precision, his movements unhurried, almost deliberate, as if he had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only made things louder than they needed to be. You were out late last night, right? The first man added casually, wiping his hands on a rag. Roads were a mess. Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, then nodded once. Yeah, just driving through. The man smirked lightly. Hope you did not run into that scene. Looks like whoever got involved is going to have a hard time explaining it. Ethan returned to his work without answering, the faint metallic click of his tools filling the space where a response could have been. The air in the shop felt different now, not tense, not yet, but shifting, like something unseen was beginning to lean in a new direction. Across town, in the same quiet hospital room, a subtle change had already begun. The woman's fingers moved first, just a slight motion against the fabric resting over her, and then her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the soft light above her. You are awake, the nurse said gently, stepping closer, her tone careful, respectful. The woman blinked once, then again, her gaze unfocused at first before settling on the unfamiliar ceiling. Where am I? She asked, her voice quiet but steady, carrying a kind of clarity that suggested she was not used to uncertainty. You were in an accident, the nurse replied. You are safe now. The woman's brow tightened slightly, not in fear, but in thought. There was someone, she said after a moment, her voice gaining strength. A man. The nurse exchanged a quick glance with the doctor who had just entered. Do you remember anything else? He asked. The woman's hand moved instinctively, brushing against the jacket still draped over her, and her fingers closed around the fabric as if recognizing something before her mind fully caught up. He stayed, she said softly. Everyone else was just watching. But he stayed. The room grew quieter, not because there was nothing to say, but because something in her tone carried weight, the kind that made people listen more carefully. Do you know who he was? The doctor asked. She shook her head slowly. No, he did not say anything. He just helped. Back at the shop, Ethan wiped his hands clean and stepped outside for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The air cooler now, calmer than the storm that had come before. He leaned lightly against the side of his truck, taking a slow breath, his eyes distant but not troubled, as if he had already accepted whatever came next before it had even arrived. Inside, the television continued to speak, voices layering speculation over silence, building a narrative that felt complete to everyone except the one person who knew how incomplete it really was. And somewhere between those two worlds, one built on quiet action and the other on loud assumptions, a single truth waited patiently, not demanding attention, not forcing its way forward, just existing, steady and unchanged, until the moment it would no longer be possible to ignore it. The next morning did not arrive quietly. It arrived with headlines, with bold text and confident voices filling the airwaves as if certainty had already been decided. And inside the small kitchen where Ethan Cole stood pouring coffee into a chipped mug, the television spoke louder than usual, not in volume, but in tone. Investigators are now looking into the involvement of an unidentified man seen near the vehicle moments before emergency responders arrived. The anchor said, her voice smooth, composed, but edged with implication. Ethan did not turn it off, and he did not turn it up either. He simply stood there, listening without reacting, as if the words were passing through him rather than landing on him. "Daddy," his daughter said from the table, her voice quieter than normal, more careful. "They are talking about someone." Ethan set the mug down slowly. "They talk about a lot of things," he replied, his tone steady, almost gentle. She hesitated. "Did you do something wrong?" The question hung in the air, not accusatory, just uncertain, shaped by a world that had already begun to draw its own conclusions. Ethan turned to face her fully, his expression calm, grounded, the kind that did not rush to defend itself. "No," he said simply. "I did what I thought was right." She studied him for a moment, searching for something deeper than words, and then nodded, accepting it in the way only trust allows. "Okay," she said softly. Across town, the hospital room no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place of movement, quiet but intentional. As the woman sat upright now, the jacket still draped across her lap, her fingers resting against the worn fabric as if it held more than just warmth. "We need to identify him," she said, her voice no longer weak, but precise, controlled, carrying a weight that shifted the room without raising its volume. The doctor glanced at her, then at the nurse. "We are reviewing security footage," he explained. "It may take time." She shook her head slightly. "No, it should not take time." There was no frustration in her tone, only expectation, the kind that came from someone accustomed to answers. "He did not stay," she continued, her gaze distant for a moment. "He left before anyone noticed. That means he did not want to be seen." The nurse frowned. "Why would someone do that?" The woman's eyes lowered briefly to the jacket. "Because he was not doing it for recognition." The room fell into a softer silence, one that carried understanding rather than confusion. Back at the auto shop, the atmosphere had changed in a way that no one openly acknowledged, but everyone felt. Conversations paused when Ethan walked by, glances lingered a second too long, and even the television seemed to speak more directly now, as if narrowing its focus. "Authorities are asking anyone with information about the unidentified individual to come forward," the anchor continued. One of the mechanics chuckled under his breath. "Man, if you were anywhere near that, you better stay quiet," he said. "They're going to pin something on somebody." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, his movements as calm as ever. "Maybe they will figure it out," he said, not dismissing, not agreeing, just stating something that sounded simple but carried a quiet weight beneath it. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting a clearer light over everything. But clarity had not yet reached the story that was unfolding. And somewhere between a man who chose silence and a woman who demanded truth, the distance between them was closing, not with noise, not with urgency, but with something far more powerful, the kind of quiet momentum that does not stop once it begins. The first sign that something was shifting did not come from the news. It came from a quiet knock on the office door at the auto shop just past noon, the kind of knock that did not belong to customers or delivery drivers, measured, deliberate, and followed by silence instead of impatience. "You Ethan Cole?" a man asked as he stepped inside, dressed too clean for the place, his shoes untouched by grease or dust, his presence enough to make the room subtly still. Ethan looked up from the workbench, wiping his hands slowly on a cloth. "Depends who is asking," he replied, his tone calm, not defensive, just grounded. The man gave a small, polite nod. "Someone who needs a few minutes of your time." A few of the mechanics exchanged glances, the kind that carried curiosity without words, and one of them muttered under his breath, "Here we go." Ethan did not react to them. He simply set the cloth down and stepped forward. "I have work," he said. "You can talk while I finish it." The man studied him for a moment, as if recalibrating expectations, then nodded again. "Fair enough. Were you on Route 17 last night around 9:30? Ethan did not rush his answer. He picked up his tool, tightened a bolt with quiet precision, and then said, "I drove through there." The man's eyes sharpened slightly. "Did you stop?" "There was an accident," Ethan replied. "I checked to see if someone needed help." The room seemed to tighten around those words, not dramatically, but enough that even the background noise felt distant for a second. "And then?" the man asked. Ethan shrugged lightly. "Then I left when others arrived." The man glanced at a small tablet in his hand, then back at Ethan. You understand there are questions about what happened before emergency services got there. Ethan met his gaze evenly. Then you should ask the people who stayed. The answer landed without force, but it did not need any. One of the mechanics shifted uncomfortably. Another turned down the television without realizing he had done it. The man in the clean suit held Ethan's gaze a moment longer, then exhaled slowly. We are trying to understand the full picture, he said. Sometimes that means talking to people who do not think they are part of it. Ethan nodded once. I understand. There was no edge in his voice, no resistance, just a quiet acknowledgement that did not invite further pressure. The man hesitated, then asked one more question. Did you take anything from the scene? Ethan paused, not because he was unsure, but because the question itself felt misplaced. No, he said simply. Did you leave anything behind? Ethan's expression did not change, but something in the air did, something subtle, almost imperceptible, like the moment before a realization fully forms. Just made sure she was not alone, he replied. The man blinked once, as if the answer had not been what he expected, and for the first time, his posture shifted, not in authority, but in consideration. Right, he said quietly. If we need anything further, we will be in touch. Ethan gave a small nod and returned to his work as if the conversation had already passed, as if it had never been more than a brief interruption in a day built on routine. The man lingered for half a second longer, then turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the room in a silence that no one immediately broke. What was that about? One of the mechanics finally asked. Ethan did not look up. Just questions, he said. But outside, as the man stepped into the sunlight and paused beside a dark sedan, he glanced back once, not at the building, but at the man inside it, and something in his expression suggested that the story he had come to confirm was no longer the same one he was leaving with. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet hospital room where certainty was beginning to take shape, the distance between truth and assumption had just grown smaller. The room did not look like a place where quiet men belonged. All polished wood and glass walls, every surface reflecting power in a way that felt intentional, designed, controlled, and Ethan Cole stood just inside the doorway with the same steady posture he carried everywhere else, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression calm, as if nothing about this moment required him to become anything other than who he already was. You can wait here, the assistant had told him minutes earlier, her tone polite but distant, the kind reserved for people who did not quite fit the setting. And now he stood alone, listening to the faint hum of air conditioning and the soft click of heels somewhere down the hallway. He had not asked why he was brought here. He had not needed to. Across the city, the questions had been growing louder, more pointed, more certain of themselves. And yet here, in this space, everything felt different, not louder, but sharper, as if truth was no longer being discussed but prepared. The door opened without announcement, and the woman stepped in, her presence quiet but undeniable, the kind that shifted the air without raising her voice. She paused when she saw him, just for a fraction of a second, her eyes settling on his face with a focus that was not casual recognition, but certainty. It was you, she said, not as a question, but as something already known. Ethan did not step forward. You are okay, he replied instead, his voice even, grounded, the same tone he had used on the side of the road. She took a slow breath, as if steadying something deeper than her body. You left, she said softly. You did not even tell anyone who you were. Ethan gave a small shrug. You did not need that, he said. You needed help. The words landed in the space between them, simple, unadorned, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but full of something that did not need explanation. Do you know who I am? She asked after a beat, her voice measured, controlled, but carrying the weight of a question she was not used to asking. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. No, he said, and it did not matter. She studied him, not with suspicion, but with a kind of careful attention, as if she was trying to understand a language she had not heard in a long time. It matters now, she said quietly, because people are building a story without you in it. Ethan looked down briefly, then back at her. Stories do that, he replied. They fill in what they do not see. She stepped closer, not imposing, not dramatic, just enough to close the distance that had been shaped by everything unsaid. I am going to correct it, she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. You do not have to do anything for me. Her expression shifted, not in frustration, but in clarity. This is not about you, she said. It is about the truth. The word hung there, steady and unyielding, and for the first time, something in Ethan's stillness changed, not outwardly, but in the quiet way he considered her words. Truth does not need noise, he said. She held his gaze. No, she replied. But sometimes it needs a voice. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, not reflective, but decisive, as if something had already moved beyond discussion into action, and somewhere outside that room, beyond the glass and polished floors, a narrative that had grown too confident in its assumptions was about to meet something it could not ignore, something that did not shout, did not argue, did not demand, but simply stood in place and allowed the truth to be seen. The room was already full before she arrived, not crowded in numbers but dense with expectation, executives seated in tailored silence, legal advisors aligned in careful rows, and a quiet tension resting over everything like a question waiting to be answered. And at the center of it all, a single chair remained empty, positioned with purpose, facing the long table where decisions were usually made without interruption. Ethan Cole stood near the back, not hidden but not announced, his presence simple, unadorned, as if he had stepped into a place that did not quite know what to do with him. And yet he did not shift, did not fidget, did not try to belong. This will not take long, a man at the head of the table said, his voice controlled, practiced, but edged with something less certain than before. We are here to clarify the events of that night. A few heads nodded. A few eyes glanced briefly toward Ethan, then away, as if unsure whether to acknowledge him or dismiss him. Then the door opened. No announcement, no build-up, just the soft click of movement followed by a presence that changed the room without raising its volume. She walked in with steady steps, her posture composed, her gaze clear, and the moment she reached the center, the quiet shifted into something deeper, something that did not invite interruption. We are not here to clarify, she said, her voice calm but absolute. We are here to correct. The words settled into the room, not loud, but final, and for a moment, no one responded. Victoria, one of the executives, began carefully. There are procedures. She raised her hand slightly, not abruptly, just enough to pause the sentence before it could finish. I was there, she said. I remember what happened. The room stilled further, attention narrowing, the air itself seeming to lean closer. There was no interference, she continued. No wrongdoing. No confusion. She turned, just slightly, her gaze finding Ethan without hesitation. There was a man who stopped when no one else did. A murmur began, low, uncertain, quickly fading as she took another step forward. He did not ask for anything. He did not wait to be seen. He made sure I was not alone. Her words carried no embellishment, no dramatics, just truth stated with a clarity that did not need support. And the story being built without him, she added, her tone sharpening just enough to be felt, is wrong. Silence followed. Not the kind that comes from hesitation, but the kind that comes from realization, when something undeniable has just been placed in the center of the room and no one can move around it. The man at the head of the table cleared his throat, his earlier certainty gone. And you are certain of this? He asked. She met his gaze evenly. I do not deal in uncertainty. The words landed with quiet authority, and something shifted, not dramatically, but decisively, like a door closing on everything that had been assumed before. No one laughed. No one questioned further. Even the smallest movements seemed to fade, replaced by a stillness that carried weight. In the back of the room, Ethan remained exactly where he had been, his expression unchanged, his posture steady, as if none of this required him to step forward or claim anything that had already been given its place. And in that moment, without applause, without recognition spoken aloud, the truth did what it always does when it is finally allowed to stand. It made everything else fall silent. The room did not erupt when the truth settled in. It did not applaud or react in any visible way. But something far more powerful took its place, a quiet that carried weight, the kind that presses gently but firmly against every person present until they recognize what they have just witnessed. And in that stillness, the narrative that had once seemed so certain began to dissolve without resistance. Ethan Cole did not step forward when eyes finally found him. He did not adjust his stance or clear his throat or try to fill the silence with explanation. He simply stood there as he always had, steady, grounded, unchanged by the shift happening around him, as if dignity did not require acknowledgement to exist. "Mr. Cole," one of the executives said cautiously, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier authority, "we would like to formally thank you." Ethan gave a small shake of his head, not dismissive, just certain. "You do not need to do that," he replied. The man hesitated, glancing briefly toward Victoria, as if unsure how to proceed in a room that no longer followed the usual rules. "It is the right thing to do," he insisted gently. Ethan met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "Then you should do it for the next person who needs help," he said. The words were simple, but they landed with a clarity that no one could redirect, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because what needed to be understood had already been said without effort. Victoria watched him closely, her expression no longer searching, no longer questioning, but settled in a way that suggested recognition beyond circumstance. "You gave me something that night," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less certain. Ethan looked at her, waiting, not expecting. "You reminded me that power does not always arrive with noise," she continued. "Sometimes it shows up quietly, and that is what makes it real." Ethan did not respond immediately, and when he did, his voice carried the same steady tone it always had. "It is not power," he said. "It is just doing what you can when it matters." She nodded once, slowly, as if accepting not just his words, but the principle behind them. Around them, the room remained still, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something that had shifted the way each person present now understood strength, respect, and truth. Outside, the world continued as it always did, traffic moving, voices rising, headlines changing direction without apology. But inside that space, something quieter had taken root, something that did not need to be announced to exist. Later that evening, Ethan returned home the same way he always did, his truck pulling into the driveway with a familiar hum, the porch light already on, casting a warm glow that felt unchanged by everything that had happened. His daughter opened the door before he reached it, her eyes bright, searching his face for answers she already trusted. "Are you okay?" she asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "Everything is fine." She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in, as if nothing more needed to be asked. Inside, the house held the same quiet